Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our Bible study today. I hope you're doing well. And it's good to see those of you in this room. We also welcome those of you that are online today. And so today we're going to do Exodus 15, the Song of Moses, which we did Sunday morning. So do I even need to say anything about it, y'all? We already got it all. But let's look at it. If you remember where we are in the story, Israel has just now been delivered from Egypt. And we pause and get this little interlude in Exodus 15. So just a reminder from Sunday about the beauty of music in worship. Worship through singing, as I've put this in your outline, this is what I shared Sunday morning. It's a tangible way we can respond to who God is, what He has done, what He is doing, and or what He will do. And music is meaningful, it's emotional, it's spiritual, it should be theological for us as Christians, and it's a beautiful gift from God. We talked about this some on our podcast yesterday with Katie and Luke. One of the things I've wondered about through the years is whether or not I would consider music, those who have the ability to write, sing, perform in a Christian context, whether or not we would even consider it one of the spiritual gifts. You know, I don't know for sure that the spiritual gifts that are listed in the Scripture are exhaustive. You know, it's certainly a pretty a list that kind of goes across the spectrum, but it doesn't technically mention singing or music. But I do think music has a certain giftedness to it. We'll get to you in a minute here, Michael, when I get to questions. One of the things, huh? Well, I would say that I think that we all have the opportunity to sing, but there are some people that are just uniquely gifted with music. True, they are just able to, to write, compose, sing, play. And I think my sense is there's a part of that you're born with. There's a certain artistic side that some people are just born with. You know, when Josiah was a little boy, we were living in Alabama, and when my parents were about to move in with us, we bought a new house. We had a home in Huntsville, and then we bought another one to accommodate Mother and Daddy. And the new house that we bought had these two little alcove kinds of things in two bedrooms, and one of them actually had a little door that you could actually go inside it. The other one didn't, but it was a small space, and Josiah was a little boy, and so it just happened to be in his room. So we decided to make it an all boys club except mom. Mom was allowed, but it was besides mom. That meant Hannah couldn't come in, obviously. So we had a sign on it that said all boys club, and he put on there except mom. And, well, across the street we had a little boy named Max, who was one of Josiah's best friends in those days. And so the inside of the little alcove thing, whatever you call it, it was sheetrocked but not painted, And so, I don't actually have permission from Cindy to decorate anything that can be seen. However, if it's unseen, then he and I got permission. So we put a few things in there, a couple of Auburn things. I don't remember what all. Well, then finally, he and his little buddy Max decided they wanted to put one of the walls to make it kind of a wall of drawings. And so I said, I think that's a great idea. So we did it. So Josiah and Max were in there drawing and whatever. And they were right at the same age. So Josiah finally came to get me and said, Dad, I want you to come look at our drawing. So I go inside and I look at the drawing, and Josiah's drawing is a mom and a dad and a little boy and a little girl, and it's stick people. You know what I'm saying? It's dad, and it has a little arrow, dad, mom, Josiah, Hannah, and then it has at the bottom, not allowed. So I said, Josiah, that's really sweet. That's great. I looked over across from it, and Max's family, they were Auburn fans as well. And so we had a little Auburn decoration Max had drawn an eagle that was swooping down from the sky with talons and a beak and a little Auburn insignia right under it. And I said, that's also good. And I looked at Josiah's and I said, and yours is good too. It was obvious Max is an artist, okay? Josiah is a Wiles. And so there were two contrasting figures on this wall. And I mean, they were only like 6 or 7 years old, so it's not like Max had been to some school to learn how to draw. Do y'all know what I mean? And turns out later in life, he's been a very artistic person. Well, some people, I just think you're born with that, and I think that's the same thing with music. I think we can all appreciate music, but some people have that gift. Have no idea how gifted Moses was as a musician, but we do know that he at least was a writer, and this song is poetry that was set to music. There's some evidence that Miriam must have been musically inclined because we get a note about her at the end of this, and so perhaps that was something connected to their family. We do know that the Jews were historically known as festive people, and so they wrote a lot of music and sang a lot of music. And so consequently, the Lord has taken music and incorporated it into our ability to worship Him, which is a beautiful thing. As a matter of fact, if you look again, I mentioned this verse Sunday morning to y'all, Colossians 3. You also have a passage in Ephesians 5 that's somewhat complementary to this text, where Paul says, let the message of Christ or the word of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit. Sing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And so the early church was even admonished to sing. And historically, the people of God have done that. They have sung when they gather together. We just have enough evidence in our worship life that that's what we do. Now, there's controversy about music in worship. Y'all are probably familiar with that. You know, there was a time when the church believed that you were only supposed to sing the Psalms. And so the Psalms, of course, are poems that are all set to music. And so we have a whole history of a branch of Christianity that uses the Psalms and only the Psalms as their worship manual and as the music of the church. We do know that when you get to the Reformation era, there was controversy about what you could sing in church and what you couldn't sing in church. Ulrich Zwingli was a very gifted musician in Zurich. Martin Luther was a gifted musician in Germany. They were two reformers who were colleagues with each other. They both pastored at the same time during the Reformation. Zwingli was the more talented musician than was Martin Luther, but Zwingli did not believe you should use musical instruments inside the church. And so the music that Zwingli wrote and produced, along with others with him, the music was not just from the Psalms. In other words, they wrote hymns and spiritual songs, but not to be accompanied with musical instruments. Martin Luther obviously wrote songs as well and incorporated the use of musical instruments. So you have these two reformers, one in Switzerland and one in Germany, who are leading the Protestant Reformation. One of them allows instrumentation in the church. The other one doesn't. Y'all know that the controversy about music, it has been found in the last 200 or 300 years. You know, when the revival movement began with guys like Ira Sankey, Dwight L. Moody, John and Charles Wesley, those men began to utilize hymns that weren't necessarily in the church, so to speak. You know, they wrote their own music for their crusades, if you want to call them crusades, their revival gatherings. And so you have a whole genre of hymnody that developed known as gospel music, which didn't actually exist prior to that time. Some of the songs that you and I now know very well that we sing often come out of that era, but they weren't necessarily embraced by the church originally because they were viewed as music that was to be played kind of at camp, so to speak, if that makes sense. So the controversy about music in the church is not really new. It's been around for a long time. Then y'all remember that when you get to the 1950s here in America, and rock and roll got introduced to American culture, over time, the older baby boomers, their families invented something new in the church, and it was called youth ministry. And prior to that, there was no such thing really as youth ministry in the church, at least in the Protestant church. Well, guess what came with youth ministry? Youth music. It came with it. But it was fine as long as it was contained to the youth, right? As long as they had it, that was okay. But y'all know what happened. Eventually, that desire for a broader spectrum of music found its way eventually into our churches, at least in the American context. So you had a whole other controversy that arose about what's allowable in the sanctuary, how contemporary can it be, does it only have to be hymns? And so there's always been, at least there have been numerous times in history where there's been a little bit of rub about music. And sometimes it's been rooted in theology. That's what Zwingli would have argued. Y'all remember that when the Christian church and the Church of Christ churches grew up in America, the Church of Christ split into two, the Christian church on the one hand and the Church of Christ on the other. The Christian church allows us, they come from the same root. They allow instrumentation in their worship. The hardline Church of Christ churches do not allow instrumentation to be in their worship. They sing all songs a cappella. So there's this winding path, and it's been fascinating to me. But regardless, at the end of the day, music is something that the Lord has embraced, in my opinion. It's something that I would even say He has suggested, maybe even commanded. When you look at the Psalms, sing a new song to me. And so it is something that we've been gifted to do, we've been invited to do, and it is a part of our worship. And so we have to find our way through it. I would tell you that I'm grateful for where we are as a church. I feel like that we have landed in a pretty good place here at our church where there's a lot of unity and sense of community together, that we offer opportunities for people to worship, and the music can be really different, but the community is built around the unity of First Baptist Arlington, so I'm grateful for it. And I don't desire to ever be in another contentious conversation about it. You know what I mean? I tell people all the time, when I die and I wake up, here are the things. If I'm moderating a business meeting, when I die and wake up, if I'm moderating a business meeting, or we're talking about coffee, or we're talking about music, or we're talking about air conditioning, I will know I'm in preacher hell. I'll know that I did not make it. I'm going to have to go through a season of cleansing before I can finally get to heaven, because if y'all knew how many conversations I've had about business meetings and about coffee and about air conditioning, about music, you would be shocked at how many of those conversations I've had. So I just like to enjoy it and see the beauty of it and see it just spread across the life of the church in ways that are healthy and conducive to the spirit of worship. So, amen, right? So with that said, you come to Exodus 15 and we have a song. And the reason we know that is because that's what the text says. They sang this song. And it's sometimes called the Song of Moses. Sometimes it's called the Song of Miriam, the Song of Moses and the Song of Miriam. Sometimes it's just called the Song of the Sea. And so let's just look at it, and I want us to read it again today. So look at this text. Then Moses and the Israelites, remember this is right after the Egyptian army, a portion of the army has been destroyed. Then Moses and the Israelites sang this song to the Lord. I will sing to the Lord, for He's highly exalted. Both horse and driver He's hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my defense. He's become my salvation. He's my God, and I will praise Him. My Father's God, and I will exalt Him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is His name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army He's hurled into the sea. The best of Pharaoh's officers are drowned in the Red Sea. The deep waters have covered them. They sank to the depths like a stone. Your right hand, Lord, was majestic in power. Your right hand, Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you threw down those who opposed you. You unleashed your burning anger and consumed them like stubble. By the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up, and the surging waters stood up like a wall. The deep waters congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy boasted, I will pursue, I will overtake them. I will divide the spoils. I will gorge myself on them. I'll draw my sword, and my hand will destroy them. But you blew with your breath, and the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who among the gods is like you, Lord? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in glory, working wonders? You stretch out your right hand, and the earth swallows your enemies. In your unfailing love, you will lead the people you've redeemed. and your strength you will guide them to your holy dwelling. The nations will hear and tremble. Anguish will grip the people of Philistia. The chiefs of Edom will be terrified. The leaders of Moab will be seized with trembling. The people of Canaan will melt away. Terror and dread will fall on them. By the power of your arm, they will be still as a stone until your people pass by, Lord, until the people you bought pass by. You will bring them in and plant them on the mountain of your inheritance, the place, Lord, you made for your dwelling, the sanctuary, Lord, your hands established. The Lord reigns forever and ever. When Pharaoh's horses, chariots, and horsemen went into the sea, the Lord brought the waters out of the sea back over them. But the Israelites walked through the sea on dry ground. Then Miriam the prophet, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. Miriam sang to them, "Sing to the Lord, for he's highly exalted. Both horse and driver he has hurled into the sea." So this song, if you'll look at how it's worded for us, it's divided into two sections. The first section are the first 12 verses. And that section of this song focuses on Moses celebrating the miraculous intervention of Yahweh that was displayed through the defeat of the Egyptians. So this song is looking backwards, okay? Now, let me just say this. When you study the books of the law, the Torah as we call it, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, the question is that scholars have is how did this material come to be? Who is the principal author? When was it finally collected? When was it placed in its final form? When do we have evidence that Israel understood it to be the law and interpreted it as such and followed it as such? And so as you might imagine, if the Exodus took place, the traditional view is around 1450 years before Christ. So we are walking back in time 2,000 years to the time of Christ, another 1,500 years or so to the time of the Exodus. So we're going to go back in time 3,500 years, okay? As you might imagine, it's very difficult to corroborate some of the theories that we have about how all of this happened when you go that far back in antiquity. There are a number of reasons for that. As I've shared with y'all before, manuscript evidence is very difficult to find prior to the first century, particularly among the Jews. And the reason for that is because the Jews historically have believed that the name of God is holy. You can't profane the name of God. That's in the Ten Commandments. You cannot take the name of the Lord in vain. And so you will notice many times when Orthodox Jews are writing about God, they will not actually write his name. They will, if they spell the word God, you'll have a capital G, a dash, and D. In other words, they don't even write the name God, much less the name Yahweh. So, if you have a manuscript that has the name of God on it, and that manuscript begins to be defaced, or it begins to deteriorate, it's by the Orthodox Jews, it's mandated that you take that manuscript and you bury it in a place where Jews are buried. So the most prominent Jewish cemeteries in the world all have a special burial area for manuscripts. Well, you can imagine when you bury a manuscript in the ground, guess what it's going to do? It'll completely disintegrate. So when you look at these ancient texts, it's very difficult to find ancient texts of the Old Testament because they were mostly buried. That's one of the reasons, we've talked about this before, the Masoretes who copied the Hebrew Old Testament for us around the year AD 1000. Those are our most ancient manuscripts of the Old Testament, are so valuable to us. So you can only imagine that if that's the oldest manuscripts we have of books like Genesis and Exodus, written in Hebrew. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, so the oldest manuscripts we have are around AD 1000. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, the Qumran community there who lived on the Dead Sea during the first century, we're not really sure why they did this. We don't know if they thought the Romans were going to attack. Who knows why they did it. They rolled up their scrolls really tightly, and they put them in these little canisters, and they hid them in the wall of the caves. Well, believe it or not, that was done around AD 40, 50 or so. those canisters, when they were discovered, still had ancient manuscripts in them that actually could be unrolled and read. And they were 1,000 years older than the current oldest manuscripts we had. Does that make sense? So you're talking about a revival of biblical scholarship. These scholars all of a sudden were incredibly overjoyed that we had found copies of the Old Testament that skipped 1,000 years in antiquity. And so John Rockefeller Jr. basically financed the oversight of getting those manuscripts collected, cared for, translated, all of that. So the good news is what we do have in our possession today is we can go back to manuscripts that were at least being used during the time of Jesus. Does that make sense? But even when you do that, you're still 1,500 years removed from what happened in the Exodus. So the challenge is, how did all these manuscripts come to be? So Moses, if you adopt Moses as the principal author of the first 5 books of the Bible, which is typically the traditional view, the question is, so even with that said, when did Moses write them? Moses is recounting events in the story of the Exodus that took place during his lifetime, okay? And so when did he write these? Some scholars believe, this is kind of the prevailing view, that when you start reading Genesis and the first 5 books of the Bible, you're about 39 years into the wilderness wanderings. Moses is at the end of his life. The children of Israel are getting ready to go into the promised land. He's not going to be with them. And so he pauses and takes the time, under the inspiration of the Spirit of God, to write all of this down for the Jews. Does that make sense? That's the prevailing view. If you adopt that prevailing view, there's also one other theory that many scholars ascribe to, which I actually believe, and that is that Exodus 15 is the first thing Moses wrote. And that view ascribes to this idea that as soon as all this happened, Moses paused and wrote a song to commemorate God's victory over the Egyptians. And it's actually the oldest piece of literature we have from Moses. And that years later, he'll reflect on all of this as he writes Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy. And so if you view it that way, then you're reading some of the freshest material on Moses' mind as soon as he sees them delivered from the Egyptians. And that is what I would contend. And so it kind of is exciting to me to study Exodus 15 if you have that view. This may be the very first thing Moses actually wrote down to celebrate something God had done. And it became the song of Moses. So with that said, what did he write? Are y'all still with me? Okay, so I think we're going back to the original event of the Exodus. And here's Moses, exuberant, full of celebration. In his mind, at this time, they're 2 weeks out from the promised land. Okay, in other words, they've been delivered. God's got them on a journey. He knows he's been to Midian. This man has traveled a good bit. He pretty much knows how long it's probably going to take them to get to Canaan. A couple of weeks, maybe 3 weeks at the most. He does not know yet, I believe, when he writes this, 40 years are going to lapse, and he's not even going to go. So I don't think that's what he knows when he writes this. So that's why I love this chapter in the Bible. So what did he write? Well, here's what he says. Let's look at it. The Lord is highly exalted. He has triumphed gloriously. That's verse 1. He is celebrating who Yahweh is. And Yahweh, when you see Lord there, it's YHWH. It's a little bit interesting later when he talks about, in verse 2, the Lord being strength. Sometimes YHWH is abbreviated just YH, which is kind of fascinating in Hebrew. And it shows up in words like hallelujah. Give praise to Yah. It's a shortened version of Yahweh. Does that make sense? So sometimes you just get Yah. You don't get Yahweh. This is one of those places where all you get is Yah. Okay, so he is strength and defender. Notice what he says about him, though, at the end of verse 2. He says it in the singular. He is my father's God. Well, is he just talking about his own dad? Most scholars would say, no, this is connected to the patriarchs. Moses is letting you know he's not some Johnny-come-lately in this story. This is a long story that stretches back to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, all the stories he heard as a little boy from his mom. Because remember, his mom nursed him even though he was given to Pharaoh's daughter, remember? So we're not sure how long Moses' mother had influence over Moses, but most people believe, most scholars believe that he was taught these stories by his mom. And then the language that he uses. Now later he's going to write the book of Genesis, okay? And so notice verse 5, the depths. They sank to the depths like a stone. Well, that's the very word you find in Genesis 1 when the Spirit of God is hovering over the depths. So it actually connects you to the story of Genesis. And who is Yahweh? Well, he depicts him as a warrior, as a man, as an anthropomorphism, in other words, that he's got this mighty right hand. And so he is to be trusted in battle, and he will deliver his people. And then he uses this phrase, with the blast of his nostrils, verse 8, with the breath of God. You'll notice that also in verse 10. Well, think about that. You read the book of Genesis, and God is going to speak things into existence. Just his breath is going to make things happen. And then there's this whole imagery of the nostrils of God. It's kind of a fascinating study in Hebrew. We talked about it yesterday on our podcast with Luke. It's interesting how God is portrayed, with these human-like tendencies and qualities, just so we can understand him. And when the Bible talks about God being long-suffering or being patient, the Hebrew actually says he's long-nosed, which is quite interesting. In other words, when you think about short breaths of blasts out of a nostril, that has a sense of being angry, if you will. But a longer breath has a sense of calm. And so the imagery is God is calm, he's patient, he's long-suffering. But in this instance, it was a quick blast of the nostril. That's what caused the Red Sea to divide. In other words, it's in the hands of God. This was not just they just happened upon some natural event and they got lucky and they're standing there going, my goodness, can you believe the wind's blowing like this? And all of a sudden the Red Sea's parted. No, it wasn't that. This was something intentional by God, done personally by him. Just like his creation of humanity was very personal. With his very breath, if you will, he brought humanity into existence. And then the final word from Moses in this section is, there is no one like you. Look at verse 11. There's just no one like God. He's the only true God. But here's what's interesting. When you get to verse 13, Moses shifts his attention to the future. Now, like I said, if this is the first thing Moses wrote, and he's unsure about everything that's in front of him, and he does not yet know that there are going to be 40 years of life, in the wilderness, and that he's not even going to go to the promised land. If you interpret this through the lens of this is the first thing he's written, well, this is a prophetic word from Moses. Moses is peering into the future. And far as he knows, we're three weeks or so away from this, and he basically says we're on our way into the promised land. And so notice how he describes that journey. Look at verse 13. He says, in your unfailing love, you will lead us. Well, that Hebrew word is the word hesed, which is found many times in the Old Testament. And I put it in there for you in your outline. And that word is really hard to put into English because it's just so multifaceted. It's translated in our English Bibles with so many different words. Mercy and faithfulness and unending love and covenant love and royal love. It's God's word. It's the word for God's love for his people. And so Moses says that's what God has given to us. It's love that never fails. And notice how God is portrayed. He's the Redeemer in verse 13. You have redeemed us. You have engaged in this activity of rescuing us. Now, Moses, he doesn't know everything about the ancient world. But again, Moses has traveled some, grew up in the courts of Pharaoh. He understands probably some of the history of Canaan, and he's also a Jew, so he's had stories of the history of Israel from Jacob making his way down to Egypt. But he also knows there are groups of people, there are tribes of people who live in the promised land. However, this has to be what Moses is thinking. How could any of them compare to Egypt? I mean, who are the Edomites in comparison to Egypt? Who are the Moabites in comparison to Egypt? So if God has already defeated Egypt, then how will any of these other people stand in front of us? Does that make sense? It's almost like that's almost a joke that all of these ites in Canaan will have any kind of ability to stop us. We've just defeated the most powerful army on the planet, the most powerful dynasty on the planet. It's clear sailing from here, basically. The Lord is just going to unfold all this. They're going to be like stone, he says. In fact, he says, we're going to cross over. Look at verse 16. The NIV says we're going to pass by. But the idea is we're going to cross over. They're going to cross over whatever barriers in their way, and God's going to give them the promised land. Now, remember, this is poetry. And so when you're writing poetry, sometimes you share things in a certain way. It may not necessarily be lived out to the exact detail of it. You know, that's not what poetry is intended to do. He's stating just this general view that God's going to deliver this land into the hands of the Israelites. Now, you and I have read the story, and we know it's going to be a little bit harder than this. They're going to struggle with some of these ites, and ultimately the Philistines, and the Midianites, and the Amalekites. I mean, there's going to be a lot of struggle for Israel to find their way in the promised land. But the point is, God is going to go before them, is what Moses is proclaiming here. And then Moses, remember, he was spoken to by God on a mountain, and God told him, one day you're going to worship me on this mountain. And now Moses has this idea that there's going to be another mountain in Israel's future where God's going to establish his presence. And of course, that's going to be known as Mount Zion or Jerusalem. And that would be the place where God would dwell with his people. And so this poem, this song, on the one hand is a celebration of what's happened. It's also an anticipation of what will happen. And so as I said, you and I do that, you know, when we sing. We sing about things that have already happened. We also sing about things that are in our future. We sing the song when we all get to heaven, right? When the roll is called up yonder. You know, I'm bound for the promised land. But we also sing about things that have happened, amazing grace. It saved a wretch like me, something in the past. So we do the very same thing. That's what Moses is doing in this song, celebrating and anticipating. Then the pause is given in verse 19, just a reminder, this is what happened. And then evidently, the Song of Miriam, verse 20, evidently what happened was the women together sang somewhat antiphonally to what the children of Israel had just sang. And Miriam led that one. And you'll notice all we get with that song is just the first couple of lines. Evidently what Moses is telling us, they sang this very same song back to each other. And so it was just a celebration, if you will, for the entire nation of Israel to celebrate what God had done for them. And y'all remember Sunday morning I mentioned to y'all what's fascinating about this song and is in Revelation 15, verse 3, what we're told is that the 144,000 who are gathered around the throne, they are singing the song of Moses and of the Lamb. And so this song of redemption evidently is still being sung in glory. So, but as I said Sunday, it shouldn't surprise us that the redeemed will be singing songs of redemption, because we'll be celebrating what the Lord has done for us throughout eternity. And so the truths of this song are actually going to continue to reverberate throughout eternity. So that's why to me, this song is so meaningful and beautiful. So it's interesting as well, because it's a little bit surprising to me. You know, if you don't know the story, you don't really know what's going on. You know, if you're just reading this story, you know, it's pretty heavy narrative. A lot of stuff is happening. There's a lot of tension. You're facing Pharaoh. The Jews are in peril. There's all this wonderment, if you don't know the story, about what's going to happen next, wonder what's going to take place next, how's God going to take care of them, how's God going to deliver them. And you get this incredible story about God's deliverance, and then all of a sudden, you just get a poem, a song. It interrupts the narrative. And actually, that's a really good literary device, you know, because when you get to crescendos, where do you go next from the Egyptian army being destroyed, you know, in the Red Sea? I mean, you've reached a crescendo. And so just as a literary person, you have to you got to drop down a little bit and give people a chance to breathe, so then you can take on the rest of the story. And so I think it's intentional that it's put here, but it also somewhat, to me, highlights the beauty of it when it's stuck in the middle of a narrative. In other words, this isn't a collection of songs. It's not a hymnal. It's a story. And in the story, we pause and sing. So to me, that even highlights the power and the beauty and the force of music and art in the middle of a narrative. And so it's a very beautiful expression, and I'm grateful that the Lord led Moses to write it. And as I said, it would be my contention, I think it's the first thing he ever wrote. So, all right, I'm going to stop right there. Thank y'all for joining us online, and we will see you next week.